The city of Atlanta hummed with life as Danielle Carter drove through the downtown streets, her mind preoccupied with the legal brief she had just finished. It had been a long day at the law firm where she worked as a senior prosecutor. She was exhausted, but satisfied. The trial she was preparing for was an important one, another case of corruption within law enforcement, something she had been fighting against for years. But tonight, Danielle wasn't thinking about work. She was thinking about home, about finally kicking off her heels, pouring herself a glass of wine, and catching up on the book she had been neglecting for weeks. Then, she saw the red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. A sigh escaped her lips. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a light. There was no reason she should be getting pulled over. Still, she did what she had been trained to do since she was a teenager. She kept her hands on the wheel, her expression calm, and waited. The cop approached her window with an air of authority that felt more aggressive than necessary. He was white, mid-40s, stocky, his uniform slightly wrinkled. His badge read, Officer Reynolds. Another officer, younger and leaner, stood behind him, hand resting on his holstered weapon. Danielle rolled down her window. "Good evening, officer." Reynolds barely acknowledged her greeting. "License and registration." She nodded, moving slowly. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "You failed to signal a lane change," he said. Danielle knew that was a lie. She had been hyper-aware of her driving. Still, she handed him her ID and registration. Reynolds took them, glancing down. His eyes flickered when he saw her name. "Danielle Carter," he read aloud. "You a lawyer or something?" Danielle didn't answer immediately. She could already sense where this was going. "Something like that," she said. Reynolds smirked, like he had won some private game she wasn't aware of. He looked at his partner. "Step out of the car." Her heart tightened, but her face remained composed. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." She didn't move. "I don't consent to an unlawful search." Reynolds's expression darkened. "Ma'am, I'm telling you to step out of the vehicle, unless you want to make this difficult." Danielle had spent years in courtrooms, hearing cases about police stops just like this. She knew the playbook. She also knew that if she were any other black woman, things could turn dangerous fast. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, standing straight. Reynolds walked around her car, pretending to look inside, while his younger partner moved behind her, too close for comfort. "You carrying any drugs or weapons?" Reynolds asked, his voice laced with mock concern. Danielle held back her anger. "Of course not." Reynolds tapped her taillight, then turned to his partner. "She's acting nervous. Might have something in the car." That was all it took. The younger officer immediately reached for his radio, calling in a K-9 unit. Danielle exhaled sharply. They were setting her up. Her name, her profession. That was why Reynolds had smirked. He knew exactly who she was, and he didn't like it. The next few minutes felt unreal. A police dog was brought in. The officer gave it a command, and just like that, the dog alerted, near her back seat. A false hit, something she had read about in countless cases. That was all the probable cause they needed. Reynolds grinned. "All right, Ms. Carter, hands behind your back." Danielle stayed still. "This is unlawful." He shrugged. "Tell it to a judge." The cuffs clicked around her wrists. The moment they tightened, something shifted inside her. They thought she was powerless. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The cold steel of the handcuffs pressed into Danielle Carter's wrists as she sat in the back of the patrol car, staring at the reflection of flashing red and blue lights on the glass. The weight of what had just happened settled over her. She wasn't just another black woman being harassed by the police. She was one of the most powerful prosecutors in the state, and these officers had no idea. Reynolds and his partner, Officer Hale, stood outside, laughing under the glow of the streetlights. Their casual arrogance made Danielle's stomach turn. She had seen men like them before, officers who thought they were untouchable, who manipulated the system for years without consequences. But tonight, they had picked the wrong woman. When they arrived at the 7th precinct, Reynolds yanked the car door open and gestured for Danielle to step out. She complied, keeping her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The booking officer at the front desk barely looked up as Reynolds handed over the paperwork. Got her on suspicion of possession. K9 hit on her car. Danielle had prosecuted cases involving corrupt K9 unit searches before. She knew this was nothing more than a fabricated stop, but she said nothing. Yet. Instead, she let them go through the entire process. Fingerprinting, mugshot, the works. They wanted to humiliate her, to remind her of who they thought held the power. Fine. She'd let them think they were winning. For now. Danielle sat on a hard bench in the holding area, still in her work clothes. The room smelled of disinfectant and stale air. Other detainees glanced at her, confused. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. An hour passed. Then 2. Then, suddenly, chaos. It started with a phone call. A desk officer picked up the line, only to immediately straighten his posture. His eyes darted toward Danielle, and his face went pale. Another call. Then another. Something was happening. The next voice she heard belonged to Captain Richard Lawson, the precinct commander. His voice was sharp, tense. Get Carter out of that cell, now. The booking officer fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them as he unlocked the holding area. Reynolds, who had been smug all night, looked confused. What's going on? He asked. Lawson turned to him, his face unreadable. You just arrested Assistant District Attorney Danielle Carter. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Danielle rose to her feet, stretching her wrists as the cuffs were finally removed. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Reynolds stiffened. That can't be right. Hale swallowed hard. She never said she was... She didn't have to. Lawson snapped. You should have checked before you pulled this stunt. Danielle met Reynolds's eyes. Let me be clear, she said evenly. Your mistake wasn't just arresting me. It was assuming you could get away with it. Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because now, they weren't the ones in control. She was. Within an hour, the entire precinct knew what had happened. 2 internal affairs investigators arrived, their presence sending a clear message. This wasn't going away. Danielle stood in the captain's office, watching Reynolds and Hale as they were grilled by the IA officers. Their false report had already started falling apart. There was no real probable cause, and the K9 alert had no supporting evidence. Hale was visibly sweating, shifting in his seat. Reynolds, however, was still in denial. This is being blown out of proportion, he insisted. She matched a description. The IA investigator didn't even look up from his notes. Of what crime? Reynolds hesitated. There was no BOLO in the system, Officer Reynolds. The investigator continued. We checked. So tell me, what description exactly did she match? Danielle already knew the answer. Black, driving a nice car, existing. The investigator leaned forward. I suggest you both start thinking about your future. because this report is going straight to the Attorney General's office." Reynolds and Hale exchanged a look. They knew what that meant. They weren't just facing suspension. They were about to lose their careers. Danielle could have let Internal Affairs handle it. She could have let their careers crumble in the slow, bureaucratic way most cases like this did. But that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever been harassed, falsely arrested, or mistreated by law enforcement. So when the case went public, she made sure she was the one leading the prosecution. 3 months later, in a packed courtroom, she stood before the judge. Her opening statement was clear, concise, and devastating. These officers abused their power. They fabricated evidence. They manipulated the law to serve their own prejudices. And tonight, they will be held accountable. Reynolds sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched. Hale looked down at the floor, avoiding her gaze. They had expected to walk free. Instead, they were about to lose everything. The courtroom was packed. Media crews lined the back, cameras capturing every moment. The case had exploded into national news, not just because 2 officers were on trial, but because the assistant district attorney herself was their victim. Danielle Carter stood at the prosecution table, calm and focused. This wasn't just about her wrongful arrest. This was about a system that had been weaponized against people like her for decades. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. Reynolds and Hale sat at the defense table, flanked by their attorneys. Reynolds still had his usual arrogance, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had spent years getting away with misconduct, but this time was different. This time, he had been caught. The judge called the court to order. The defense attorneys tried to paint Danielle's arrest as a simple misunderstanding, an error in judgment, not intentional misconduct. But Danielle had built her case too well. She had the body cam footage. She had the precinct records showing falsified reports. She had statistical evidence proving a pattern of racial profiling by the 7th precinct. And now, she had witnesses. One of the first to take the stand was Sergeant Henry Adams, a veteran officer from the same precinct. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't as corrupt as Reynolds and Hale. He had been offered immunity in exchange for testifying against them. When he took the stand, his voice was steady. "This wasn't a mistake," he said, looking directly at the jury. They knew exactly what they were doing. Danielle watched as Reynolds' face hardened. "They targeted her," Adams continued. "They knew she was an attorney, and they thought they could teach her a lesson." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The defense attorneys scrambled to discredit Adams, but the damage had been done. Then came another bombshell. Officer Lisa Martinez, a young cop who had worked under Reynolds, hesitated before taking the stand. Her hands shook slightly. She had been one of the few honest cops in the department, but she had stayed quiet for too long. "I saw them do this before," she admitted, "not just to Ms. Carter, to other people, mostly black men. They'd pull them over for no reason, search their cars, intimidate them. It was a game to them." Danielle watched as Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "They laughed about it," Martinez continued. "They called it cleaning up the streets. But really, they were just targeting innocent people." The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were angry. By the time the closing arguments were finished, Danielle knew what the outcome would be. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the judge asked the foreman to read the verdict. "On the charge of false imprisonment, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of fabricating evidence, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendants guilty. A ripple of satisfaction spread through the courtroom. Reynolds closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. Hale looked like he was about to be sick. Danielle didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply breathed. Justice had been served. The ruling sent shockwaves through the department. Internal Affairs expanded their investigation into the 7th Precinct. Officers who had participated in similar misconduct were either fired or forced to resign. Reynolds and Hale were sentenced to prison time, their careers destroyed. And the impact went beyond Atlanta. The case became a catalyst for change, forcing police reform policies in multiple states. Danielle had prosecuted hundreds of cases in her career. But this one? This one mattered in a way none of the others had. Because this time, it wasn't just about the law. It was about fighting back against a system that had tried to silence her, and winning. Months later, Danielle sat in her office, looking over the next round of cases. There was still so much work to be done. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Carter, your next client is here." Danielle glanced at the clock, nodding. "Send them in." She straightened her blazer, took a sip of coffee, and got back to work. Because the fight for justice never stopped. And as long as she was breathing, she wasn't going to stop either.